Welcome to week 3 of the Advanced JavaScript class. For week 3, the primary focus is going to be on dynamic HTML. And when we're talking dynamic HTML, what we're really talking about is how do I modify the HTML document that is initially presented to the user using JavaScript. And that's really the definition that I'm using for dynamic HTML. So dynamic HTML encompasses a couple of things. The first is, how do I create new HTML elements? And that would include, how do I create elements and their corresponding attributes? And then secondarily, how do I position those newly created elements that I built in JavaScript on the HTML DOM for the user to see? So those are kind of the two main pieces that this week will focus on, is how do I create HTML elements, and then how do I position those HTML elements on the page so that users can see them. As a side note to that, we have to also consider the fact that those HTML elements can be nested within one another. So we can create complex HTML elements. So we can create, a div tag that contains other tags, or we can create a form that contains other HTML elements. And really, that positioning is extended to that situation as well. As I'm positioning elements for the user to see, but I also might be positioning my newly created elements within or nested within a tag that I just created. Okay, so you have some reading elements that are online resources. How do we create an element? How do we append it? And then how do we use insert before to attach that? There's some videos that I'd like you to watch. They're YouTube screencasts of how do we position those elements. So kind of an introduction. How do we create them? And then how do we get them on the screen? Then how do we position them on the page? And then how do we create complex or nested DHTML elements? And then lastly, the homework for the week is going to focus on dynamic HTML. So you have lab 3. I asked you to kind of create a nested HTML element, and you'll submit that. I'll have a lab 3 submission link here under week 3 soon. And then you'll also have the week 3 check-in, which is kind of the traditional check-in of, how are things going? Is life good? Are you able to keep up? Is anything preventing you from completing your work? Okay, so kind of a standard week. In the meantime, you should be working towards that project. So project 1 details, just to kind of give you a heads up, your project is a tax calculator, and I'm going to jump down to the bottom to introduce the project. So I give you an example user interface where you're prompting the user to enter their gross salary, and you're going to calculate a tax table for them. Okay, so here's kind of the loading screen. And then once you've loaded the screen, you should be able to calculate the taxes. So your gross pay entered was $30. You pay a 10% federal tax. I can't remember what the state tax is, but it comes out to $1.06. Medicare, Social Security, a total, and then based on that total, you have a net pay. So project 1 is this tax calculator. If I scroll up now, we get into the details of how we actually calculate those taxes. So all of the tax information is targeted at single filers. So we're not filing married or married joint or married single. We are filing as single taxpayers. So obviously this wouldn't necessarily apply to your tax situation, but it's a tax calculator if I was filing as a single filer. Okay, so the idea here is that, let's say I made $50,000. So my first $98.75 would be taxed at 10%. Then the next block of income from $98.76 to $41.25, that block of income would get taxed at 12%. And then finally, the block of income from $41.26 to $50,000 would get taxed at 22%. and I would take the sum of those 3 blocks of income to come up with my federal tax rate. The state tax is essentially the same thing. And then lastly, we get into details about how Social Security and Medicare taxes are calculated. They're what's known as FICA taxes. Okay, so both of those are considered FICA taxes and how we actually calculate those. Okay, so that's project 1, and what I would suggest is that at this point you can probably start to take a look at project 1 and maybe even get started and start to hit some pain points of, I've started, I've got to this point, and now I'm stuck. So maybe you have some questions and things like that. I'm going to be posting a Slack thread for project 1, so as you're running into questions with project 1, feel free to use that to post in there. Okay, otherwise, have a great week.